Hi, and welcome to Somnahist. This is my first story, a calm journey through the moments when food changed history. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful tales about how the smallest things shaped the biggest events, consider subscribing or just staying a while. History isn't only made by battles and kings. Sometimes it's written by what we eat or what we can't. From the year the sun went dark, to famines that drowned Europe, to poisoned bread and fields of hunger, food has built and broken civilizations. This is disastrous dining, foods that ended kingdoms or changed history forever. A story of hunger, survival, and how a single meal can alter the fate of the world. Chapter 1. The Year the Sun Faded, 536 AD and the Volcanic Winter. They called it a year without light. The world dimmed, and no one quite knew why. Across Europe and Asia, chroniclers wrote in confusion, recording a sky that refused to shine, a sun that hung pale and ghostly, as if dying behind a veil. The year was 536 AD, and though no one could name the cause, humanity stood at the edge of one of the most catastrophic natural events in recorded history. A volcanic winter so severe that it unstitched civilizations, altered economies, and left a scar on the human story that would linger for generations. In Constantinople, the Byzantine historian Procopius described it with awe and dread. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. His words weren't poetic exaggeration. Scientists today know that somewhere, perhaps in Iceland or Central America, a massive volcanic eruption threw unimaginable volumes of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. That ash circled the globe, blocking sunlight, cooling the planet, and twisting the seasons. It was as if time itself slowed, wrapped in a gray haze. Imagine waking up in that year. You're a farmer in what is now Ireland, or maybe a shepherd on the slopes of Anatolia. The morning feels wrong. The light never quite reaches full day. The birds are quiet, and when you look at the fields, your barley stalks are short, weak, pale. The summer never truly comes. Across Europe, frost touches the crops in midsummer. In China, snow falls in June. There are no harvests. The rivers run sluggish and dark. And when the store is empty, when the grain runs out, there is only hunger. People began to eat bark, roots, and whatever animals they could catch. Some boiled grass. In the north, the Norse sagas would later remember this time as the Fimble Winter, the great winter before the end of the world. And perhaps to them, it must have felt exactly that way. Crops failed not just once, but for several years. Famine took hold from Ireland to India. In the Byzantine Empire, whispers of divine punishment spread faster than reason. Priests led processions through ash-dark streets, begging for sunlight. Fields turned to mud, and the air carried the metallic scent of despair. But the tragedy of 536 was not just in the hunger itself, it was in what came after. When food disappears, so does stability. The weakened and malnourished populations became vulnerable to the next disaster waiting in the shadows: disease. Only a few years later came the plague of Justinian, the first great pandemic in human history, a cousin to the Black Death that would ravage Europe centuries later. The plague swept through the weakened Byzantine Empire, killing tens of millions. It did not only end lives, it ended momentum. Economies collapsed, armies disbanded, and entire regions were abandoned. The historian Michael McCormick once called 536 the worst year to be alive. And perhaps he was right. Across Asia, the Tang dynasty's predecessors recorded harvests that never came, and strange celestial phenomena, red dust in the air, and sunsets that never truly faded. In South America, tree rings and ice cores show the same global cooling. This was not a local tragedy. It was Earth itself shuddering. Average temperatures dropped by nearly 2 degrees Celsius, enough to throw off the rhythm of life everywhere. By 540, the ash settled, but the damage was done. Crops were gone, cattle dead, populations displaced. Some regions would take centuries to recover. Empires that had looked eternal, the Sassanids, the Byzantines, the early European kingdoms, suddenly looked fragile, even mortal. And yet, amid the gray and the hunger, there were survivors, ordinary people who endured the impossible. In every ruined village and every starving city, humanity refused to end. They adapted. They learned to dry what little grain grew. They discovered that moss could be boiled into something like soup. Families clustered together for warmth, sharing the last crumbs of bread, whispering prayers into the dark. This quiet, stubborn endurance, this refusal to surrender, is what carried civilization through the shadowed years. We can still see it today, frozen in the ice. In the glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists find layers of volcanic dust, tiny glass particles marking that dark year. When light passes through them under a microscope, they shimmer, remnants of the ash that once blocked out the sun. And if you listen to the old chronicles, they still hum with fear, confusion, awe. The monks in Ireland wrote of failed crops and empty bellies. In China, they said the yellow dust fell like snow. And in the Mediterranean, people wrote that the sun had turned blue. It is strange, isn't it, how much the world depends on the small, steady things we take for granted? Light, warmth, food, a single harvest. Lose them, and the grandest empires crumble like sand. The story of 536 is not just about nature's power. It is about fragility. The fragility of order, of comfort, of civilization itself. When the world dimmed that year, it reminded humanity of something we often forget, that all of history's monuments, its kings, its temples and libraries, ultimately rest on the same simple, shared foundation, the harvest. Without food, there is no future. So when the sky darkened and the fields failed, it was not merely a famine, it was a reckoning, a reminder that every empire, no matter how proud, depends on something as delicate as a seed of barley and a patch of sunlight. And for one long, terrible year, both were gone. The people of 536 didn't know what volcano or mountain had stolen their sun, but they knew what hunger felt like. They learned what silence sounds like when no birds sing, and they learned that survival sometimes is the only kind of victory left. Chapter 2. Bread and Boats in Ruin, the Great European Famine, 1315 to 1317. It began, as disasters often do, not with fire or war, but with rain. Endless, unrelenting rain that fell like judgment from the sky. The year was 1315, and Europe had just settled into what it thought was a new age of prosperity. The population had grown. Villages stretched further into the forests. Fields were full of wheat, barley, and rye. The medieval world believed itself blessed, a continent under divine favor. But the balance was fragile, and it would take only the sky itself to break it. In the spring of 1315, the clouds gathered and never left. Rain poured over France, the Low Countries, Germany, and England. Rivers swelled, roads dissolved into mud, and fields turned to shallow lakes. The seeds rotted before they could sprout. The hay that was meant to feed livestock through the winter never dried, and the cattle began to die, first by the thousands, then by the millions. The peasants called it the drowning of the world. To them, it felt like Noah's flood had returned, but without the promise of salvation. At first, people waited it out. They told themselves that next season would be better. But the rain didn't stop. It fell through the summer, through the autumn, and into the next spring. By 1316, food stores had run dry. Bread, once the heart of every meal, became a rare luxury. The price of grain tripled, then quintupled. Even the wealthy began to worry. In London, bakers sold loaves so small and thin that people whispered they were mixed with ground bark. In the countryside, peasants boiled weeds and roots to make something like soup. Some slaughtered the few animals that had survived the wet, diseased pastures, eating them long before they were fat enough to sustain anyone. And then came the true horror, hunger that twisted the mind. Chronicles from the time tell stories that sit uneasily in the stomach even now. In Flanders, there were reports of parents abandoning children on the roadside because they could no longer feed them. In France, chroniclers wrote of travelers being attacked and eaten. Monks wrote in their ledgers of strange meat appearing in markets. Whether those stories were true or not, they reveal something deeper: the sense that civilization itself was slipping. The famine did not strike evenly. Some towns were able to import grain by river or sea, but transport was slow and dangerous. Pirates and tolls took their share. A ship carrying grain from the Baltic might arrive only after months, by which time its cargo had spoiled. In some places, desperate rulers issued decrees forbidding the hoarding of grain, but even kings cannot order the sky to clear. The French king, Philip V, opened his royal granaries to the people, but there was too little to go around. By 1317, the famine had spread from Scotland to Italy. Historians estimate that at least 10 to 15% of Europe's population died, not from plague or war, but from the simple, relentless absence of food. What hunger leaves behind is not only death but doubt. Faith itself began to rot. For generations, people had believed that good harvests were God's reward and bad ones His punishment. So what did it mean that even the faithful starved? That priests and nobles died beside peasants in the same mud? The social contract, the invisible promise that kings would protect, that prayers would provide, began to tear. Out of that tear would grow something centuries later: the idea that authority could fail, that people might one day rule themselves. But for now, all that filled the void was silence and rain. If you stood in a village in the middle of those dark years, you'd see it in the faces: the hollowness of eyes that had stopped expecting food, the way people no longer looked up when the church bell rang, because there was nothing left to ask for. In the manor houses, lords tried to keep order, demanding tithes that no one could pay. Fields lay fallow. Grain, when it did grow, was often moldy, producing a strange sickness in those who ate it: a trembling in the limbs, a burning in the skin. Some believed this was ergot poisoning, the same fungus that would later be blamed for witchcraft hysteria. But at the time, it was just one more curse in a world already drowning. And yet, even as the famine devoured lives, it also reshaped the land. Forests reclaimed fields. Wolves returned. The roads that had once carried trade turned to grass. Human ambition took a step back, and nature quietly began to heal. When the rains finally broke in 1317, the survivors emerged into a changed Europe. The population had been cut, the economy shattered, and the trust in divine and royal protection deeply shaken. But the soil, exhausted and emptied, was finally free to recover. Within a generation, the land grew fertile again, and those who remained would build new villages, new ways of living, slowly forgetting the taste of bark and the smell of wet rot. Still, something lingered. The memory of hunger has a long shadow. It stayed in stories and songs, in the cautious way peasants stored grain, in the deep cultural dread of empty granaries. The Great Famine became the quiet ancestor of the Black Death a few decades later, a warning that the balance of life in Europe could be undone by the smallest shifts in weather, the briefest act of chance. When we read those old accounts now, the rain still falls between the lines. The scribes and monks who recorded the famine rarely gave numbers or causes. They wrote in emotions: grief, confusion, guilt. One monk ended his entry with the words, "We waited for the sun, and it did not come." It's strange how familiar that sounds, isn't it? As if the same whisper echoed from 536 to 1315, 2 centuries apart, but joined by the same fear. What happens when nature, our oldest ally, turns her face away? In the quiet after the storm, the survivors learned a truth that still echoes through history, that the simplest thing, a field of grain, is the heartbeat of civilization. And when that heart stops, so does everything built upon it. Chapter 3. White Loaves, Dark Secrets, Food adulteration in Victorian Britain. London, 1855. The dawn smells of coal smoke and damp stone. Carts rattle over cobblestones slick with rain, and the city exhales a heavy sigh of steam. The Age of Progress, they called it. An empire at its glittering height, its factories breathing life into a new world of invention and industry. But beneath the gas lamps and brass machines, another revolution was unfolding. One not of steel, but of flour. It was a quiet betrayal that began inside the baker's oven. And for millions of the poor, it would turn the staff of life into an agent of death. Bread was the cornerstone of survival. For the working class, it was breakfast, lunch, and supper, the single affordable constant in a city where meat was luxury and vegetables a rumor. A loaf of bread could mean the difference between hunger and health, between another day's work, or the slow fading of starvation. But as London swelled to millions, as poverty thickened like fog in the alleys, the demand for cheap bread became impossible to meet honestly. The millers and bakers, pressed by competition and greed, found a simple answer: deception. They began with chalk. White, harmless enough, it made coarse flour appear pure. Then came alum, a chemical used for dyeing cloth and tanning leather. Mixed into the dough, it whitened the bread further and kept it soft for days. The people loved it. The poorer the district, the whiter the loaves. A cruel irony, because the whiteness that promised cleanliness was in fact poison. The alum tore at stomach linings, stripped nutrients from the body, and left children thin, weak, and hollow-eyed. Still, the loaves sold. Bakers boasted of their fine, snow-white crumb. Housewives lined up in soot-streaked aprons, clutching a few pence, unaware they were buying slow death wrapped in comfort. Reports began to surface in the 1840s. A chemist named Arthur Hill Hassell tested bread from London's markets and was horrified. Of 20 samples, more than half were tainted with alum, plaster of Paris, even lead. The news trickled into Parliament, but the powerful bakers' guilds dismissed it as hysteria. The poor could not afford better, and the rich, who dined on meat and wine, hardly cared what filled the bellies of those who served them. The deception continued, spreading like mold through the empire. In Manchester and Liverpool, alum bread was sold beside arsenic-bright sweets colored with copper and mercury. Industrial progress had discovered a way to feed poison as cheaply as hope. Imagine the scene: a mother in a one-room flat on the East End. The wallpaper peels from the damp. She tears a loaf in half for her 2 children. The crust is pale, the texture oddly dry, but it is warm. They eat it in silence. Within weeks, the children's stomachs swell, their skin turns ashen, their energy bleeds away. Doctors call it wasting disease, never linking it to the bread that was supposed to save them. In the workhouses, men collapse at their benches. In the mines, boys faint from exhaustion, all fueled by bread that filled the stomach but starved the blood. As scandals mounted, a slow awakening began. Reformers like Thomas Weckley, founder of The Lancet, exposed the grim chemistry of Victorian food. They printed tables of findings: how the milk was watered down, the beer mixed with strychnine, the sweets with copper salts, and in the center of it all, the daily loaf. Public outrage grew until the government was forced to act. The Adulteration of Food and Drugs Act of 1860 was the first real attempt to protect consumers. It was imperfect, easily dodged by clever merchants, but it marked a beginning. For the first time, the empire acknowledged that progress without ethics was just another famine in disguise. Yet the memory of those toxic loaves lingered long after the law changed. They became a symbol of an age that prized polish over purity. White marble, white bread, white lies. In the quiet kitchens of the poor, trust had been broken. Mothers sniffed flour before kneading. Workers eyed their rations suspiciously. The betrayal had been too intimate. Food was no longer sacred. It had become industrial, mechanical, suspect. And from that suspicion would grow a modern truth: that the things we eat must be protected, measured, tested. Because hunger makes us vulnerable. And vulnerability invites exploitation. When you walk today through a supermarket aisle, beneath bright lights and sealed packaging, every label and regulation is an echo of those grim Victorian years. Pure, unbleached, organic, all born from a time when purity was an illusion sold by men in aprons dusted with chalk. The bread looks harmless now, soft and golden. But hidden in its history is the reminder that civilization has been poisoned before, not by malice alone, but by the quiet arithmetic of profit over life. The soot of that age has long been washed from the city walls, yet if you listen closely on a cold London morning, beneath the hiss of buses and the rattle of trains, you might still hear the ghosts of the bakers, ovens, a faint scrape of shovel against stone, the smell of yeast and dust, and the echo of a promise broken, that food, the simplest gift of survival, should never have been a weapon. Chapter 4. The Blighted Potato and the Shattered Island. The Irish Great Hunger. The year was 1845, and the island of Ireland was green, impossibly green. From the low stone walls of Kerry to the damp fields of Connacht, the landscape shimmered with the color of plenty. Potatoes stretched in every direction, their leaves thick and dark, their flowers pale against the mist. To the people, it was more than a crop. It was a lifeline. In those quiet rural cottages, families of 10 or 12 lived by the rhythm of that single root. Each morning began with potatoes boiling in the black iron pot. Each evening ended the same way. It was humble, filling, dependable. For generations it had never failed them. Until one day, it did. That autumn, farmers walked into their fields and smelled something strange. The air carried a sour, sickly scent, almost sweet, almost rotten. When they bent to the plants, their fingers came away black. The leaves had turned to slime, the stalks sagged, and beneath the soil, the potatoes, those soft white treasures, were rotted into foul mush. The people didn't know the name of the thing that had come for them, a fungus called Phytophthora infestans, brought across oceans by trade and wind. All they knew was that the earth had betrayed them. Within weeks, the blight spread like a shadow across the island. Fields that had promised life now reeked of death. The Irish had endured hardship before. Poor harvests, cruel landlords, storms. But this was different. The potato wasn't just a food. It was the foundation of existence. The average peasant ate almost 3 kilograms of potatoes a day. Without them, there was nothing left. Yet the cruelty of the famine wasn't only in the crop's failure. It was in the silence of those who could have helped. Ireland was then under British rule, its government centered in London. And across the sea, the crisis was treated as misfortune, not emergency. Officials believed in the cold philosophy of the free market. If food prices rose, they said, the invisible hand would balance them. So they let it rise. Merchants kept exporting grain and beef out of Ireland, even as Irish families starved. Ships loaded with oats and cattle sailed from Cork and Belfast, past the same coasts where bodies washed ashore. By the winter of 1846, the countryside was a cemetery of hunger. Roads were lined with silent processions of people leaving home, gaunt mothers clutching infants, barefoot men carrying sacks of nothing. They walked toward the ports, toward the ships bound for America or Canada, though many never reached them. Fever followed famine. Typhus and dysentery bloomed in the weakened bodies of the survivors, spreading through the workhouses and the fever sheds, where the sick were piled together. Those who lived called it the Great Hunger. Those who died left no words. Imagine a small cottage somewhere near Galway. Smoke no longer rises from the chimney. The family that once filled the air with laughter now lies still on the earthen floor. The pot on the hearth is empty, the fire long gone cold. In the corner, a mother's hand still rests on a child's shoulder. No one buried them. No one had the strength. The parish priest who might have come has buried too many already. Outside, the rain falls on the thatch and the fields where the blight still lingers, blackening the ground like rot on an old photograph. From 1845 to 1852, more than 1 million people died, and another million fled. The island that had once held 8 million souls was cut almost in half. The ships that carried them away were called coffin ships. Packed tight in darkness below deck, passengers slept beside the dead. The Atlantic swallowed thousands. Yet, for many, death at sea was better than the slow death on land. They sailed toward the unknown with stomachs empty, but hearts clinging to the faintest light of survival. The famine reshaped Ireland in ways no war ever could. It hollowed the island's villages, left its hillsides scattered with abandoned cottages, their walls still standing in silence today, green with moss. It broke the old Gaelic way of life, shattered the connection between people and land, and turned hunger into inheritance. The trauma sank deep, so deep that even generations later, Irish songs and stories still carry a tremor of loss, a soft ache that never fully fades. Politically, the famine changed everything. The belief that the British government had allowed Ireland to starve out of neglect or prejudice fueled the fire of nationalism. From the ruins of hunger rose movements that demanded independence, voices that carried pain instead of gratitude. The famine taught a bitter lesson, that self-reliance was the only protection against indifference. And so, in the silence left by starvation, a new kind of resolve began to grow, fragile, quiet, but unbreakable. Scientists would later find that the blight had been caused by a strain of fungus so resilient that it still exists in samples today. But history is not written in spores, it's written in memory. And the memory of those years is not just of disease, but of betrayal. The Green Island turned gray, and for the first time, the Irish learned that hunger could be political. When a government watches its people starve and calls it economics, hunger becomes an accusation carved into the land itself. Even now, if you walk the west coast of Ireland at dusk, you can see the traces. Stone walls built for famine relief, walls that go nowhere, built by hands that trembled from hunger, paid not in coin, but in food. They still cross the hills, leading into the mist, ending in nothing. They are the bones of the famine made visible. And if you listen as the wind moves through them, it almost sounds like breath, like the island itself, still mourning, still remembering, still waiting for the harvest that never came. The Great Hunger was not just a disaster, it was a transformation. It changed the course of a nation, scattered its people across the world, and turned food, that simplest of human needs, into a weapon of power. The blight may have been nature's doing, but the famine was man's. And that difference, that cruel, deliberate difference, is what keeps the memory alive. Because hunger, once made political, never truly ends. It just changes shape, changes name, and waits for the next season. Chapter 5. Feasts of Failure. More than one plate too few. Throughout history, hunger has rarely shouted, it whispers. It seeps quietly through the corners of empires, through the cracks in marble palaces and wooden cottages alike. It doesn't arrive with the noise of war, but with the stillness of absence. A missing loaf, an empty bowl, a silence at the table where food used to be. Yet in that silence, kingdoms have fallen, revolutions have begun, and the course of humanity has bent in directions no king or general ever intended. The stories we've shared tonight, the dimmed sun of 536, the drowned fields of medieval Europe, the poisoned bread of Victorian London, the rotting potatoes of Ireland. They are not separate tragedies. They are chapters of the same quiet book, the story of how food, or the lack of it, shaped civilization itself. Every age believes it has conquered hunger, that progress will keep the plates full forever, and every age learns, sooner or later, that nature and greed both have longer memories than we do. When the volcanic ash of 536 choked the skies, people thought it was the end of the world, and in a way, it was the end of one version of it. That year reset humanity's balance with nature, reminding us that all our cities, temples, and crowns rest on the same fragile chain of sunlight, soil, and seed. When medieval Europe drowned under years of rain, it wasn't just crops that died. It was faith in protection, the illusion that order would save us from chaos. Out of that hunger grew rebellion, the slow erosion of divine right. And when the Victorians poisoned their own bread in pursuit of profit, it revealed a darker truth, that even in times of plenty, people can still starve, not from scarcity, but from deceit. The Irish famine carried that lesson further. It showed how hunger can be inflicted, how it can become an instrument of control. The blight might have been natural, but the famine was manufactured by indifference. Millions left their homeland, carrying their grief across the oceans, and with them, the memory that the greatest cruelty is not hunger itself, but watching others eat while you cannot. The world has not forgotten that taste. And yet, beneath the weight of these losses, there is another story running quietly, the story of endurance. For every famine, there were those who shared their last crumbs. For every poisoned loaf, someone found a way to expose the truth. For every storm and failed harvest, humanity learned to adapt, to plant again, to invent, to survive. The persistence of life is its own kind of rebellion, a silent, steady refusal to end. Food is not just nourishment, it is memory. It is the echo of every ancestor who lived long enough to pass down a recipe, a habit, a way of cooking that survived war and drought. To eat is to remember that someone before you endured hunger so that you would not. The bread you break, the rice you boil, the salt you scatter, they are all relics of survival, the quiet inheritance of those who refused to vanish when the world turned cold. Perhaps that is why meals, even today, hold something sacred. A table surrounded by people, laughter in the air, a shared dish. It is one of the few moments when civilization feels simple again, when all the noise of progress fades into something older and purer. Yet even now, as we speak, hunger still walks the earth. Not as famine, perhaps, but as inequality. There are still full plates and empty ones, still rich cities and barren fields, still echoes of 1315, 1845, and 536, repeating themselves in quieter ways. If history teaches anything, it is this. Civilization is not built on stone or steel, but on grain. Empires rise when the harvest is good and crumble when the weather changes. The line between feast and famine is thinner than we like to believe. And though we no longer pray to the sun for our bread, we still live at its mercy. Maybe, in the end, that's what makes us human, this eternal dance between abundance and loss, between hunger and hope. We are the only species that can cook, and perhaps also the only one that can starve itself through arrogance. We poison, hoard, and waste, yet we also gather, share, and nurture. Food has always been our greatest contradiction, capable of binding us together or tearing us apart. So when we look back at those who lived through the gray skies of 536, the starving villages of the 14th century, the soot-stained bakeries of London, or the haunted fields of Ireland, we are not looking at strangers. We are looking at ourselves, stripped of comfort, reminded of our dependence on the earth, on each other, on the fragile network that keeps us alive. And maybe that is the truest meaning of history, not remembering the kings who dined, but the ones who went hungry. Not the banquets of victory, but the quiet nights when families huddled around an empty pot and still managed to light a candle, whispering prayers into the dark. And so this was Disastrous Dining, foods that ended kingdoms or changed history forever. A journey through hunger, deceit, and survival, through centuries of meals that shaped the fate of millions. I'm Somnahist, and this was my first story with you. If you've made it this far into the night, thank you for listening, for letting these forgotten voices share your quiet for a little while. If you'd like to keep wandering through history's softer corners, where empires fall as quietly as bread crumbles, you can like, subscribe, or simply stay. There will always be another story waiting when you can't sleep. Food built the world, and sometimes it destroyed it. So the next time you eat, take a moment. Remember the hands that planted, the storms that came. Good night, and remember, even history gets hungry.